He was a quiet, awkward farmer in a small Wisconsin town. His neighbors thought he was harmless, a little strange, but harmless. When police entered his farmhouse in 1957, they discovered a house of horrors. It would inspire three of the most iconic horror movies ever made: Psycho, The Texas Chain Saw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. They found furniture upholstered with human skin, bowls made from skulls, a belt made of human nipples, masks made from the faces of dead women, a shoebox full of vulvas, and the decapitated head of the local hardware store owner, freshly killed. Gein had only murdered 2 people, but what he did with human bodies was so disturbing that it changed horror cinema forever. This is the story of Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, the man who turned his mother's death into a nightmare that would haunt America for generations. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. His father, George Gein, was an alcoholic who could barely hold a job. His mother, Augusta Gein, was a fanatically religious woman who believed that all women except herself were prostitutes and instruments of the devil. She was domineering, puritanical, and obsessed with sin and damnation. She preached to her 2 sons, Ed and his older brother Henry, about the evils of the world, particularly the evils of women and sex. She told them that women were sinful, dirty, and would lead them to hell. She forbade them from making friends, from dating, from having any social life at all. The Gein family lived in isolation on a small farm outside the town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Population 700. Ed worshipped his mother. He was completely devoted to her, obeying her every command without question. He was a small, effeminate boy who was bullied at school and had no friends. His only relationship was with his mother, who controlled every aspect of his life. His father was a violent drunk who Augusta openly despised. She ran the household with an iron fist, and Ed absorbed every word she said about the wickedness of the world and the purity that could only be found through devotion to God and to her. When Ed wasn't at school, he worked on the farm, did odd jobs for neighbors, and spent his evenings listening to his mother read Bible passages about death, murder, and divine retribution. His childhood was one of complete isolation, religious fanaticism, and psychological abuse. In 1940, when Ed was 34 years old, his father George died of heart failure, likely brought on by years of alcoholism. Ed and his brother Henry continued to run the farm with their mother, but Henry had begun to question their mother's grip on their lives. He started to criticize Augusta, suggesting that her religious fanaticism was unhealthy and that her control over Ed was damaging. Ed was horrified by this betrayal. His mother was sacred to him, and Henry's criticism was blasphemy. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were fighting a marsh fire on their property. That evening, Ed returned home alone and told police that he had lost sight of Henry in the smoke. When police searched the property, they found Henry's body lying face down. There was a bruise on his head, but the official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. Many investigators later suspected that Ed had killed his brother, but no charges were ever filed. Now it was just Ed and his mother, alone on the farm, exactly as Augusta wanted. But their isolation wouldn't last long. In 1945, Augusta suffered a stroke. Ed became her caretaker, nursing her obsessively, terrified of losing the only person who had ever mattered to him. But on December 29, 1945, Augusta suffered a second stroke and died. Ed Gein was 39 years old, and the center of his universe had collapsed. He was utterly alone for the first time in his life. Neighbors said he cried for days. He boarded up the rooms his mother had used, her bedroom, the living room where she had preached to him, preserving them exactly as they had been when she was alive, like shrines to her memory. He lived in a small section of the house, the kitchen and a bedroom, while the rest became a mausoleum to Augusta Gein. But something broke inside Ed when his mother died. The psychological damage of a lifetime of abuse, isolation, and fanatical religious indoctrination finally manifested in the most horrifying way imaginable. Ed became obsessed with death, with bodies, with his mother. He began reading anatomy books, medical texts, and adventure magazines that featured stories about Nazis, cannibals, and headhunters. He became fascinated by the human body and what could be done with it. And then he started visiting the local cemetery at night. He would read obituaries in the newspaper, looking for women who had recently died, women who reminded him of his mother. Then he would go to the cemetery, dig up their graves, and take the bodies home. Between 1947 and 1952, Ed Gein robbed dozens of graves in 3 local cemeteries. He would bring the bodies back to his farmhouse and dissect them. He removed skin, bones, and organs. He tanned the skin and used it to create horrifying objects. He made lampshades from human skin. He upholstered chairs with it. He made a wastebasket from human skin. He created a woman's suit, a full bodysuit made from the skin of female corpses that he would wear at night, dancing around his house in the moonlight, pretending to be his mother. He made masks from the faces of dead women and wore them. He made a belt decorated with human nipples. He kept skulls as bowls and bedposts. He preserved vulvas in a shoebox. His farmhouse became a grotesque museum of human remains. But grave robbing wasn't enough. On December 8, 1954, Ed Gein committed his first murder. Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old woman who ran a local tavern, disappeared. There was blood on the floor and a spent rifle cartridge, but no body. The case went cold. No one suspected the quiet, awkward farmer who occasionally did odd jobs around town. Ed had shot Mary in the head, loaded her body into his truck, and taken her back to his farm. He decapitated her, hung her body upside down in his shed like a deer carcass, and butchered her. He kept her head as a trophy. When police later found Mary Hogan's head in Ed's house, it had been preserved and was sitting on a shelf like a decoration. For 3 years, Ed lived with his collection of human remains, his woman's suit, and the preserved head of Mary Hogan. He continued to do odd jobs for neighbors, who described him as strange but harmless. He babysat for local families. He was invited to dinner by people who had no idea what was inside his farmhouse. He was polite, quiet, and socially awkward, but no one suspected that he was wearing a suit made of human skin under his clothes, or that his house was filled with the remains of dead women. Ed Gein was hiding in plain sight, and his neighbors had no idea they were living next to one of the most disturbing killers in American history. On November 16, 1957, Ed Gein walked into Worden's hardware store in Plainfield. The store was run by Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old woman who lived alone. Ed had been in the store several times recently, and Bernice's son, Frank Worden, who was the deputy sheriff, had noticed that Ed seemed to be paying unusual attention to his mother. That morning, Ed asked Bernice about antifreeze. She went to the back of the store to check the price. Ed pulled out a .22 caliber rifle from the store's own rack, loaded it, and shot Bernice Worden in the head. She died instantly. Ed locked the front door, loaded Bernice's body into the store's delivery truck, and drove back to his farm. He hung her body upside down in his shed, decapitated her, and began to butcher her like a deer. When Frank Worden arrived at the hardware store that evening and found his mother missing, blood on the floor and the cash register gone, he immediately suspected Ed Gein. He remembered Ed's visits and his interest in his mother. He also found a receipt for antifreeze with Ed's name on it, the last transaction before Bernice disappeared. Frank called the sheriff, and that night, police drove out to Ed Gein's remote farmhouse. What they found would become one of the most notorious crime scenes in American history. When police entered the darkened shed behind Ed's house, they shined their flashlights upward and saw what they initially thought was a deer carcass hanging from the ceiling. Then they realized it was a human body, a woman, decapitated, gutted, and hung upside down like an animal. It was Bernice Worden. She had been killed that morning. The officers were horrified, but the horror had only begun. When they entered the main house, they discovered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The house was filthy, cluttered, and filled with garbage and debris. But scattered among the trash were objects that made no sense at first, until the officers realized they were made from human remains. There were 4 noses in a cup. There was a shoebox containing 9 vulvas. There were skulls that had been cut and polished to use as bowls. There were bedposts decorated with skulls. There was a lampshade made from the skin of a human face. There were chair seats upholstered with human skin. There was a wastebasket made of human skin. There was a sheath for a knife made from human skin. There were leggings made from human leg skin. There was a vest made from the torso of a woman, complete with breasts. There were 10 female heads, some preserved, some just skulls. There was a belt made from human nipples. And most disturbing of all, there was a full woman's suit, a vest and leggings made from tanned human skin that Ed could wear to transform himself into a woman, into his mother. The police also found the head of Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Her face had been painted and preserved. Ed had kept it as a trophy. In total, police identified remains from at least 15 different women in Ed Gein's house. Most of them had been dug up from local cemeteries, but 2, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, had been murdered. The farmhouse was a house of horrors, a grotesque collection of human remains that Ed had been accumulating for years. The officers who processed the scene were traumatized. Some had to seek psychological counseling. The local community was in shock. How had this been happening for years without anyone knowing? Ed Gein was arrested and taken into custody. He confessed immediately, calmly describing how he had robbed graves and killed 2 women. He showed no remorse and seemed confused about why people were so upset. He explained that he had been trying to create a woman suit so he could become his mother, so he could bring her back. He said he had considered a sex change operation, but decided it would be easier to create a suit from real women. He described his grave robbing expeditions in detail, explaining how he would dig up fresh graves, take the bodies home, and dissect them. He said he entered a kind of trance state and couldn't always remember exactly what he had done. Psychiatrists who examined him diagnosed him with schizophrenia and found him mentally unfit to stand trial. Ed Gein was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. He spent 10 years there before being found competent to stand trial in 1968. He was charged only with the murder of Bernice Worden. The Mary Hogan murder was not prosecuted because Ed had already been found insane. At trial, Ed pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury deliberated for just 1 week before finding him not guilty by reason of insanity. He was sent back to the psychiatric hospital, where he would spend the rest of his life. He never expressed remorse for his victims. He spent his days doing odd jobs around the hospital, reading, and occasionally talking to psychiatrists about his mother and his crimes. Meanwhile, Ed Gein's farmhouse became a macabre tourist attraction. Thousands of people drove out to Plainfield to see the house where the horrors had taken place. Souvenir hunters stole pieces of the property. The house was eventually burned down in March 1958, officially ruled as arson, though no one was ever charged. Many locals believed it was deliberately destroyed to end the ghoulish tourism. Ed's car, which he had used to transport bodies, was sold at auction and displayed at county fairs as the Ed Gein Ghoul car. The sensationalism around the case was intense and disturbing, but Ed Gein's true legacy was in Hollywood. His crimes were so shocking and so bizarre that they captured the imagination of writers and filmmakers. In 1959, just 2 years after Ed's arrest, author Robert Bloch wrote the novel Psycho, inspired by Ed Gein. The character of Norman Bates, a man dominated by his mother, who preserves her corpse and takes on her identity, was directly based on Ed. Alfred Hitchcock adapted the novel into the iconic 1960 film Psycho, which became one of the most influential horror films ever made. The shower scene, the preserved mother, the split personality, all inspired by Ed Gein in 1974. Director Tobe Hooper created the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, one of the most brutal and influential horror films of all time. The character of Leatherface, who wears masks made from human skin and decorates his house with human remains, was directly inspired by Ed Gein. The film's aesthetic of rural horror, human skin furniture, and bone decorations all came from the Ed Gein case. The film was banned in several countries and became a cult classic that defined the slasher genre. In 1988, Thomas Harris published The Silence of the Lambs, featuring the character of Buffalo Bill, a serial killer who murders women and skins them to create a woman suit so he can transform himself into a woman. This was directly inspired by Ed Gein's woman suit and his desire to become his mother. The 1991 film adaptation won 5 Academy Awards and made Buffalo Bill one of cinema's most terrifying villains. Ed Gein's crimes had inspired 3 of the most iconic horror villains in film history: Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill. Ed Gein lived in the psychiatric hospital for 26 years. He was described as a model patient, quiet, cooperative, and polite. He made friends with other patients and staff. He seemed like a harmless old man, nothing like the monster who had created a house of horrors. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure due to lung cancer. He was 77 years old. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, next to his mother Augusta, the woman who had dominated his life and whose death had triggered his descent into madness. His grave was unmarked for years because souvenir hunters kept stealing the headstone. Even in death, Ed Gein remained a source of morbid fascination. The Ed Gein case raises profound questions about the nature of evil, mental illness, and the impact of childhood trauma. Ed was clearly severely mentally ill. His schizophrenia, his psychotic breaks, his inability to distinguish between reality and his delusions were all documented by psychiatrists. But he was also the product of extreme psychological abuse. His mother's fanatical religious indoctrination, her domination of every aspect of his life, her teachings that women were evil and sex was sinful. All of this warped Ed's development and left him unable to function as a normal human being. When she died, he couldn't let her go. He tried to bring her back, to become her, by creating a suit from the skin of women who reminded him of her. But mental illness doesn't fully explain Ed Gein. Thousands of people suffer from schizophrenia and don't murder people or rob graves. Thousands of people have domineering, abusive parents and don't create furniture from human skin. At some point, Ed made choices. He chose to dig up graves. He chose to shoot Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. He chose to create his house of horrors. Mental illness may have distorted his perception of reality, but it didn't remove his agency entirely. The Ed Gein case exists in the uncomfortable space between illness and evil, between victim and monster that the two women Ed Gein murdered, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, are often forgotten in the sensationalism surrounding the case. Mary Hogan was a 51-year-old tavern owner, hardworking and independent. Bernice Worden was a 58-year-old hardware store owner, a mother and a respected member of the community. They were real people with families who loved them, and they died terrifying deaths at the hands of a man who saw them not as human beings, but as materials for his grotesque projects. Their families had to live with not only their deaths, but also the knowledge of what Ed had done to their bodies. The trauma extended far beyond the immediate victims. The people whose graves Ed robbed were also victims, though they were already dead. Their families had buried them with dignity, believing their loved ones would rest in peace. Instead, Ed violated their graves, stole their bodies, and desecrated them in the most horrifying ways imaginable. When police identified the remains in Ed's house, they had to notify families that their mothers, daughters, and sisters had been dug up and turned into furniture and clothing. The psychological damage to the community of Plainfield was immense and lasting. Ed Gein's case also changed how law enforcement and mental health professionals understood serial killers and disturbed individuals. Before Ed Gein, the idea of someone creating objects from human remains seemed like something from a horror story, not reality. Ed proved that human depravity could exceed even the darkest imagination. His case influenced the development of criminal profiling and the study of psychopathology. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit studied the Ed Gein case extensively when developing their understanding of serial killers and sexually motivated murders. The cultural impact of Ed Gein cannot be overstated. He inspired not just 3 major films, but countless books, documentaries, songs, and works of art. He became a symbol of rural American horror. The monster hiding in the farmhouse, the quiet neighbor with unspeakable secrets. He influenced the entire horror genre, establishing tropes that are still used today. The isolated farmhouse, the domineering mother, the human skin masks, the furniture made from bodies. Every time someone watches Psycho or the Texas Chain Saw Massacre or The Silence of the Lambs, they're experiencing the legacy of Ed Gein. But this cultural fascination is troubling. Ed Gein has become almost mythological, a boogeyman, a character in horror stories. This risks turning real horror into entertainment and forgetting that Ed Gein was a real person who committed real atrocities against real victims. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden were real women who died in terror. The families who discovered their loved ones' graves had been robbed experienced real trauma. The officers who processed that crime scene were really traumatized. Ed Gein's story is not entertainment. It's a tragedy and a horror that destroyed lives. Today, Plainfield, Wisconsin, is still haunted by Ed Gein's legacy. The town has tried to move past its association with one of America's most notorious killers, but tourists still come looking for Ed Gein sites. The farmhouse is long gone, burned down in 1958. The hardware store where Bernice Worden was killed is gone. But Ed's grave remains in Plainfield Cemetery, still occasionally vandalized by souvenir hunters. The town's population is still around 900 people, and many residents are tired of being known as Ed Gein's town. They want to be remembered for something other than the horrors that happened there. In 1957, Ed Gein killed only 2 people, far fewer than many serial killers. But the nature of his crimes, the grave robbing, the human skin objects, the woman suit, the house of horrors, made him one of the most infamous criminals in American history. He proved that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures, but human beings whose minds have been twisted by trauma, mental illness, and isolation into something unrecognizable. Ed Gein's story is a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facade, that the quiet neighbor doing odd jobs might be concealing unimaginable darkness. The story of Ed Gein is not a story of a criminal mastermind or a calculating predator. It's the story of a profoundly damaged man whose childhood of abuse and isolation destroyed his ability to function as a human being. It's the story of a mother whose fanatical control over her son created a monster. It's the story of a small town that discovered unimaginable horror in their midst. And it's the story of 2 women who died simply because they reminded a disturbed man of his dead mother. Ed Gein's legacy is not just the horror films he inspired, but the reminder that the line between sanity and madness, between human and monster, can be thinner and more fragile than we want to believe.